The darkroom smelled like almonds and metal, acetic acid from the stop bath mixing with the tang of silver halide. Marcus Chen's fingers traced the edge of the photograph suspended from the drying line, still damp, still revealing itself in gradients of gray. Outside, through the light-proof seal of the door, he could hear the muffled chaos of the hospital corridor. Squeaking gurneys, the pneumatic gasp of automatic doors, someone crying in short, staccato bursts. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though the darkroom was always cold, the ventilation system humming its perpetual white noise. Not from excitement, though the image emerging on the fiber paper was exactly what he'd envisioned, a construction worker's silhouette against the skeleton of a rising building, light bleeding through the steel framework like veins of gold. The shake came from somewhere deeper, something he couldn't name, a tremor that started in his chest and radiated outward. He reached for the tongs, but his hand passed through them, literally through them. Marcus jerked backward, colliding with the enlarger. The negative carrier clattered against the baseboard. He stared at his hand, solid, real, the callus on his right index finger from years of pressing shutter buttons still visible in the amber safe light. He reached for the tongs again. This time his fingers closed around the metal. The door opened. White light knifed through the darkness, ruining 3 prints hanging on the line. God damn it! Marcus spun around, but the words died in his throat. His father stood in the doorway, younger than Marcus remembered, the gray not yet threading through his temples. The lines around his eyes shallow instead of carved. He wore the same blue custodial uniform from the hospital, but it fit differently. Less stooped shoulders, more of the military bearing he'd carried back from 2 tours overseas. Dad? Your mother called. His father's voice was wrong, too. Softer, uncertain in a way that Marcus associated with other people's fathers, not his own. The baby's coming. We need to go. What baby? His father's expression shifted. Confusion, then concern. Are you okay? You've been talking about nothing but this baby for months. Your sister? May. The name came out automatically, and with it, a cascade of memories that weren't quite memories, more like photographs someone else had taken, developed, and hung in his mind. May at 6, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the cheap point-and-shoot he'd bought with his first paycheck from the college newspaper. May at 14, sullen and angry, slamming doors because he'd missed her violin recital for a gallery opening. May at 22, calling him from the hospital, her voice thin with pain, asking where he was while her husband paced in the waiting room. But May was 36. She had 3 kids. The oldest was in high school. Unless... Marcus looked down at his hands again. No wedding ring. The scar on his left thumb from the broken light bulb incident? Gone. He was wearing his NYU hoodie, the one he'd thrown away in 2009, threadbare and paint-stained and smelling like the communal washing machines in the dorm basement. What year is it? His father's concern deepened into alarm. 2004. Marcus, should I call someone? Did you hit your head? 2004. 22 years ago. The darkroom tilted. Marcus grabbed the counter, his fingers landing in the developer tray, the chemical burn immediate and familiar. He yanked his hand out, watching the liquid drip from his fingers, clear, slightly viscous, exactly the temperature of blood. I'm fine. The words came out steady, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a shutter on continuous drive. I'm fine, just got lost in the work. Let me clean up. His father hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. I'll bring the car around. The door closed. Darkness again. Marcus stood in the red glow of the safe light, breathing in the almond metal smell, trying to catalog what he knew. He was 23. He was in the dark room at NYU, the one in the journalism building basement that was always too cold and smelled like decades of chemical baths. His sister was having her first baby. He was supposed to be there. But in the original timeline, the one that felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago, he'd been at Cassandra's apartment instead, trying to explain why he couldn't come to her stepfather's fundraiser because his sister was in labor, listening to her cry about how he never prioritized their relationship, how photography was more important to him than she was, how she needed to see commitment from him. He'd gone to the fundraiser, missed the birth. May had forgiven him eventually, but something had broken between them that night. A hairline fracture that had spread over the years until they barely spoke. Marcus looked at the prints hanging on the line, already ruined by the light. In his mind, he could see the others. Thousands of them. Images he'd taken over 2 decades. moments frozen in silver and light, the ones he'd sold when Cassandra convinced him digital was the future and film was a dying art. The ones he'd given away when they moved into her condo and she said the storage unit was too expensive. The ones he'd lost when he'd sold his equipment, the Leica M6, the 50mm Summilux, the Hasselblad 500C/M with the Zeiss planar 80mm. He could see them in his mind, feel the weight of them in his hands. He'd sold them in 2007, 3 years from now, because Cassandra wanted to start her interior design business and needed capital. Because she said it was a test of his commitment, that if he really loved her, he'd sacrifice his hobby for their future together. Because he'd been 26 and stupid and so desperate to prove he was good enough for someone like her, wealthy, connected, beautiful in a way that made people turn their heads on the street. The business had failed within a year. She'd left him within 2. And the Leica M6 with the Summilux, that specific combination, with its particular wear pattern and the modification he'd made to the light meter, had sold at auction in 2019 for $43,000 to a collector in Tokyo. He'd seen it on the vintage camera forums, had recognized the scratch on the base plate from when he dropped it on the subway tracks, had felt like someone was reaching into his chest and squeezing. Marcus switched on the white light. The prints on the line were completely blown out now, the images erased by exposure. He didn't care. He was already mentally cataloging everything in his camera bag, everything in his apartment, every piece of equipment he'd accumulated during his college years. He had 3 years. 3 years before he met Cassandra at a gallery opening in Chelsea, before she turned those green eyes on him and said his photographs made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, before she started the slow process of convincing him that he needed to choose between her and his art. 3 years to build something different. Marcus rinsed the developer off his hands, dried them on his jeans, and walked out of the darkroom. The hospital corridor was exactly as he'd heard it through the door. Bright fluorescence, antiseptic smell, the controlled chaos of a Saturday night in a Manhattan emergency room. His father was waiting by the elevator, keys in hand. "Ready?" "Yeah." Marcus fell into step beside him. "Dad, thank you for coming to get me." His father glanced at him, something unreadable in his expression. "She's your sister. Where else would you be?" The baby was born at 11:47 p.m., a girl, 6 pounds and 8 ounces, with a full head of black hair and lungs like an opera singer. May, exhausted and radiant in equal measure, held her daughter with the kind of fierce tenderness that made Marcus's throat tight. Her husband, David, stood beside the bed with his hand on May's shoulder, looking like someone had just shown him the meaning of existence. Marcus stayed in the corner with his camera, the Nikon F5 he'd bought used from a graduating senior, capturing moments, David cutting the umbilical cord, his hands trembling. The nurse weighing the baby, the scale's red numbers glowing in the dim light, May's face when they placed her daughter on her chest, that first moment of recognition between mother and child. He shot on film, Tri-X 400 pushed to 1600, because the light was low and he wanted grain, wanted texture, wanted these images to feel like memories even as they were being made. "You're really in the zone," May said softly. She looked tired, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but happy in a way Marcus hadn't seen in... When was the last time he'd seen her happy? In the before time, the original timeline, when had they last been close? He couldn't remember. That was the worst part. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, lowering the camera. "You're beautiful." "Oh, this whole thing is beautiful." "You sound like a photographer." "I'm a photographer." "I know." May's smile was gentle. "I'm glad you're here. I know Cassandra wanted you at that thing tonight." Marcus froze. "What?" "Her stepfather's fundraiser. She called Mom's house looking for you. She sounded pretty upset." "We're not..." He stopped. They weren't together yet. Couldn't be. He'd met her in 2007 at the gallery opening, or he was supposed to meet her in 2007. But if she was already calling him, already making demands... "How do I know Cassandra?" May gave him a strange look. "You've been dating for 2 months. Are you sure you're okay? You're acting really weird." 2 months. That meant he'd met her in November 2003, not 2007. The timeline was already different, already changed, and he didn't know how or why or what it meant. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Just tired. It's been a long night." Go home. Get some sleep. Come back tomorrow and take more pictures. May yawned, carefully adjusted the baby in her arms. I want good ones. None of that soft focus Hallmark card stuff. Real photographs, the kind you're good at. Marcus nodded, but he didn't move. He was thinking about Cassandra, trying to remember how they'd met in the original timeline. The gallery opening in Chelsea, her red dress, the way she'd laughed at something the gallerist said. But that was 2007. If they'd met in 2003 instead... His phone buzzed. A text message, the screen glowing blue-white in the dim hospital room. Where are you? You promised you'd be here. This is really important to my family. He stared at the message, at the name at the top, Cassandra Whitmore. So, you should answer that, May said. She's going to be pissed if you don't. Yeah, Marcus said distantly. Probably. But he didn't answer. He turned off his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and went back to taking photographs. The apartment was exactly as he remembered it, which was to say, exactly as he'd forgotten it. A fifth-floor walk-up in the East Village. The kind of place that was charming if you were 23 and in love with the idea of being a starving artist. Less charming if you were 45 and your knees hurt on the third flight of stairs. The radiator clanked and hissed. The refrigerator hummed arrhythmically. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor practicing violin at 2 a.m, the same passage over and over, slightly out of tune. Marcus dropped his camera bag by the door and stood in the center of the room, taking inventory. The Leica M6 sat on the desk by the window, next to a stack of contact sheets in a loop. The 50mm Summilux was attached, the lens hood slightly dented from when he'd bumped it against a fire escape while shooting in Brooklyn. The Hasselblad was in its case under the bed, wrapped in a soft cloth, the medium format film back loaded with Ilford Delta 100. $43,000. That's what the Leica alone would be worth in 15 years. The Hasselblad, if he kept it in good condition, maybe $30,000. The various lenses, filters, accessories, another $20,000. Conservatively, nearly $100,000 in equipment, and he was living on ramen noodles and day-old bagels from the bakery down the street. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Cassandra. I can't believe you're ignoring me, after everything I've done for you. Marcus stared at the message. Everything she'd done for him. In 2 months of dating, what had she done for him? In the original timeline, the one that felt like a dream he was waking from, she'd introduced him to gallery owners, helped him get his work shown, supported his career. Or at least, that's what he'd told himself. Looking back now, he could see it differently. She'd introduced him to gallery owners who wanted a certain aesthetic, who wanted him to shoot commercial work instead of the street photography he loved. She'd helped him get shown in galleries where his work hung next to generic landscapes and still lifes, where serious collectors never looked. She'd supported his career the way someone supports a houseplant, enough to keep it alive, not enough to let it grow. He typed a response. I'm sorry, family emergency. My sister had her baby. I'll call you tomorrow. The response was immediate. Your sister? You chose your sister over my family? Marcus deleted the message thread, then he deleted her number. Then, feeling reckless and free in a way he hadn't felt in decades, he blocked her completely. Tomorrow, he'd deal with the fallout. Tonight, he was going to sleep in his own bed, in his own apartment, with his cameras within arm's reach and his life still full of possibility. The light woke him, sharp and golden, slicing through the gap in the curtains and landing directly on his face. Marcus blinked awake, disoriented. His body expecting the memory foam mattress and blackout shades of his Tribeca studio, finding instead the futon that was too short and the windows that faced east and let in every sunrise like a personal affront. He lay there, cataloging sensations. The ache in his lower back from the inadequate mattress, the cold air on his face from the window he'd cracked open because the radiator was too efficient, the sound of the city waking up. Garbage trucks, car horns, someone shouting in Spanish about parking. It was real. All of it was real. He was 23 years old, and he had a second chance. Marcus got up, ignored the coffee maker that would take 20 minutes to produce something lukewarm and bitter, and went straight to his camera bag. He pulled out a notebook, the small moleskin he'd used for shot lists and exposure notes, and started writing. November 2003. Met Cassandra. Break it off now. 2005. Stock market. Google IPO, Apple. 2006, real estate peak. Sell before 2007. 2007, don't sell equipment. Don't sell equipment. 2008, financial crisis, buy real estate. The list went on. Everything he could remember from 22 years of living, investing, watching the world change. Tech companies that would explode, startups that would fail, political events, natural disasters, the slow, steady accumulation of knowledge that came from living through something once already. But even as he wrote, he felt uneasy. The timeline was already different. He'd met Cassandra 4 years earlier than he remembered. What else had changed? What else would change? Now that he was making different choices, his phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call. The ringtone he'd set for his mother. Some J-pop song May had loaded onto his phone as a joke. "Hey, Mom." "Marcus?" His mother's voice was warm, slightly accusatory. "You're coming to dinner tonight, yes? To celebrate the baby?" "Of course." "Good. And bring that nice girl, Cassandra. She called me last night, very upset that you missed her event." Marcus's stomach sank. "She called you?" "She was worried about you. Said you weren't answering your phone. I told her about May, about the baby, but she seemed..." His mother paused, choosing her words carefully. "Upset that you didn't tell her. She said you two were supposed to go together to this fundraiser." "We never talked about it." "That's not what she said." And there it was. The beginning of the pattern, Cassandra rewriting history, making him feel like he'd forgotten something, agreed to something, failed to live up to some unspoken expectation. In the original timeline, he'd spent years apologizing for things he wasn't sure he'd actually done wrong, trying to be better, trying to be enough. "Mom, I don't think Cassandra and I are going to work out." Silence on the other end. Then, "You just started dating." "I know, but I don't think she's right for me. She's from a good family, she has good connections, she could help your career." "I don't want help with my career. I want to take photographs." "Those are the same thing." "No," Marcus said quietly. "They're really not." Another pause. He could hear his mother breathing, could imagine her in the kitchen of their house in Queens, probably making dumplings for tonight's celebration, the phone wedged between her ear and shoulder. "Okay," she said finally, "but you come to dinner, and you bring photos of the baby, real ones, printed." "I will." After she hung up, Marcus sat on the futon, staring at the Leica on his desk. The morning light caught the chrome accents, made them glow. He picked up the camera, felt the weight of it in his hands, brought it to his eye, and looked through the rangefinder at the window, the fire escape beyond, the city stretching out in shades of gray and gold. This camera would be worth $43,000. But that wasn't why he was keeping it. Cassandra showed up at his apartment at noon, without calling, without warning. Marcus heard the knock and knew somehow that it was her. He'd been in the dark room, his bathroom with a blackout curtain rigged over the door, developing the film from last night, and his hands were still wet with fixer when he opened the door. She looked exactly as he remembered, which was to say, exactly as he'd tried to forget. Tall, slender, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than his rent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, her makeup subtle, but perfect. She was beautiful in the way of magazine covers, the kind of beauty that looked effortless but required immense effort to maintain. "Hi," she said, her voice soft, her eyes red-rimmed. "Can we talk?" Marcus stood in the doorway, blocking entry, very aware of the fixer dripping from his fingers onto the floor. "Wait, I'm in the middle of developing film. This will just take a minute. Cassandra, please." She looked up at him, and he saw it, the expression he'd fallen for in the original timeline. The vulnerability that seemed so real, so raw. "I'm sorry about last night. I was upset, and I said some things I didn't mean. But you have to understand, that fundraiser was really important to my stepfather. He was counting on me to bring someone, to show his friends that I'm settled, that I'm with someone good. You're using me to impress your stepfather? That's not..." She stopped, recalibrated. "I'm saying that I needed you there, and you chose your sister instead. My sister was having a baby. I know, and that's beautiful, really, but you could have come to the fundraiser first. It was just for a few hours. You could have made an appearance. You met some people and then left." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the person she was, but the person she would become. The woman who would convince him to sell his cameras. The woman who would make him feel guilty for spending weekends in the darkroom instead of at brunch with her friends. The woman who would leave him for a hedge fund manager with a house in the Hamptons and never look back. No, he said. No what? No, I couldn't have. And no, I don't think this is going to work. Her expression shifted, surprise, then hurt, then anger. Are you breaking up with me? We've been dating for 2 months. 2.5, and I thought it was going somewhere. I thought you were different. I am different, Marcus said. That's the problem. He closed the door while she was still standing there, her mouth open, an objection forming. He heard her knock again, harder this time, heard her voice through the door. You're making a huge mistake. You could have had everything. I could have introduced you to people, real photographers, people who could have helped you. Marcus went back to the bathroom, back to the darkroom, and continued developing his film. The images emerged in the red glow of the safe light. His sister's face, exhausted and radiant. The baby's tiny fists. David's hands, strong and gentle, cradling his daughter. Moments of love, of family, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Cassandra knocked for another 5 minutes, then left. Marcus didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow, like he'd just avoided a car accident by inches and was still processing how close he'd come to impact. In the original timeline, he'd stayed with her for 5 years. 5 years of slowly losing himself, of making himself smaller to fit into her world, of waking up one day and realizing he didn't recognize the person looking back at him from the mirror. He hung the negatives to dry, then went to his desk and picked up the phone. Metro Photo Center. A bored voice answered. Hi, I'm looking for information on camera insurance, vintage equipment. Hold, please. While he waited, Marcus pulled up his email on his laptop, the ancient Dell that took 5 minutes to boot up, and started researching. Vintage camera collectors, auction houses, the trajectory of film photography as digital took over the market. He knew the broad strokes, but he needed details, needed to understand exactly when certain cameras peaked in value, which models were most sought after. The insurance agent came back on the line. Okay, what kind of equipment are we talking about? Marcus listed it all. The Leica M6 with the Summilux, the Hasselblad 500C/M, his collection of vintage Nikon lenses, the Rolleiflex he'd bought from an estate sale, the Canon AE1 that had been his first real camera. That's quite a collection for a student, the agent said. I've been collecting for a while. Current value? Maybe 8,000 total. And you want to insure it for? Marcus paused. He couldn't say 100,000. That would raise questions, but he needed to protect it, needed to make sure that no matter what happened, no matter who came into his life or what financial pressures emerged, he couldn't just liquidate his equipment on impulse. 15,000, he said. Well, I think some of this will appreciate. Film equipment, with digital cameras getting better every year? Yeah, Marcus said. Call it a hunch. The semester ended in a flurry of finals and deadlines. Marcus turned in his senior project, a photo essay on night shift workers in Manhattan, shot entirely on film, entirely in black and white, and watched his professor flip through the prints in silence. She was in her 50s, a former photojournalist for The Times, and her opinion mattered more than grades. These are good, she said finally. Really good. Where are you applying after graduation? I'm not sure yet. You should talk to Michael at Magnum. They're always looking for young talent. Or apply to The Times. They have a fellowship program. Marcus nodded, but he was thinking about the original timeline. About how he had applied to Magnum, had been rejected, had ended up freelancing for wedding photographers and corporate event companies because he needed to pay rent. About how the rejection had stung, had made him doubt himself, had left him vulnerable when Cassandra started talking about how photography was just a hobby, how he needed to think about a real career. I want to keep shooting film, he said. Is that stupid, with everything going digital? His professor considered this. It's not stupid, but it's not practical either. The industry is changing. Magazines want digital files. They want instant turnaround. Film is becoming a luxury. What if I don't care about practical? She smiled. Then you're either going to be brilliant or broke. Possibly both. After the meeting, Marcus walked through Washington Square Park, with his camera around his neck, watching the chess players and street performers and NYU students sprawled on the grass despite the December cold. He shot sparingly, thoughtfully, waiting for moments that mattered. His phone rang. An unknown number. Hello? Marcus Chen? A woman's voice, professional, crisp. Speaking. This is Jennifer Marsh from Aperture Foundation. I'm calling about your submission to the Emerging Photographer Showcase. Marcus's heart stopped. He hadn't submitted anything to Aperture. Couldn't have. The showcase wasn't until… When was the showcase? He couldn't remember. In the original timeline, had he even applied? I'm sorry, he said. What submission? A pause. Your professor, Dr. Catherine Marks, submitted your work on your behalf. The Night Shift series? We'd like to include it in our spring exhibition. You would? The selection committee was unanimous. Your use of available light, the way you capture these quiet moments of dignity in labor, it's exactly what we're looking for. We'll need high-resolution scans, of course, but we can work from your negatives if you prefer. Marcus sat down on a bench, his legs suddenly unreliable. Yes, I prefer that. Working from negatives. Perfect. I'll send you the details. And Marcus, this is really good work. Don't stop shooting. After she hung up, Marcus sat in the park for a long time, watching the light change, feeling the weight of the camera against his chest. In the original timeline, he'd been so focused on Cassandra, on trying to make her happy, that he'd let opportunities slip away. He'd stopped submitting to exhibitions, stopped taking risks with his work, stopped believing that what he saw through the lens mattered to anyone but himself. Now, he had a showcase at Aperture. Now, everything was different. The exhibition opened in March, during that strange period when winter was fighting its last battle and spring was tentatively advancing. Marcus stood in the gallery, surrounded by his own photographs printed large, 3 feet by 4 feet, mounted on aluminum, the grain visible and intentional. Workers at a 24-hour diner, the cook's face illuminated by the grill's glow. A janitor in an office building, pushing a buffer across marble floors, the city lights reflected in the polished surface. A nurse in an empty hospital corridor sitting against the wall, eyes closed. Taking a moment of rest, people moved through the space, studying the images, reading the captions. Marcus stayed in the corner, trying not to listen to their comments, failing completely. There's something classical about these, someone said. Like Brassai, but American. The light is incredible. How did he expose for this? Film. It has to be film. You can see it in the tonality. His mother appeared beside him, elegant in a dark dress, looking proud and slightly bewildered. Very nice, Marcus. Very professional. Your father wanted to come, but he has to work. I know. He's proud of you too. He just doesn't say it. May was there with David and the baby, now 4 months old and alert. Her dark eyes taking in the gallery like she understood what photography meant, what these frozen moments represented. You made it, Marcus said, genuinely surprised. Of course we made it. You're my brother. Plus, for free wine. May grinned, then grew serious. These are beautiful, Marcus. Really. I didn't know you could see people like this. Like what? Like they matter. Like their lives are worth documenting. Everyone's life is worth documenting. A man approached, older, 60s maybe, wearing an expensive suit and a Leica M7 around his neck. Marcus Chen? Yes? Robert Hartley. I collect photographs. Primarily documentary work, street photography. I'd like to buy 3 of these prints. Marcus blinked. They're not for sale. This is just an exhibition. Everything is for sale at the right price. What would you say to $5,000 per print? $15,000. That would cover his rent for a year. More than a year. But these prints, this work, it was the beginning of something. If he sold them now, they'd disappear into someone's collection, and he'd have nothing to show for the series except money. I appreciate the offer, Marcus said carefully, but I'd like to keep the work together, maybe in the future. Hartley's eyebrows rose. You're turning down $15,000? I'm investing in my career, the collector laughed. Brave or foolish, either way, keep my card. When you're ready to sell, call me. After he left, May elbowed Marcus in the ribs. Did you just turn down $15,000? Yeah. Are you insane? Probably. But he wasn't. He was thinking about the long game, about building a reputation, about keeping his work in circulation where it could lead to other opportunities. In the original timeline, he'd sold everything too quickly, too cheaply, desperate for validation and rent money. This time, he was going to be smarter. A woman in her 30s approached, notebook in hand. Marcus Chen, I'm Sarah Wu from The Village Voice. Can I ask you a few questions about your work? And so it began. Summer came, and with it, graduation. Marcus walked across the stage in his cap and gown, accepted his diploma, and felt nothing. The ceremony was a formality. Real life had already started. He'd rented a studio space in Brooklyn, a former factory building that had been converted into artists' lofts. His space was small, 200 square feet, barely room for a darkroom and a workspace. But it had northern light and high ceilings, and rent he could almost afford thanks to a grant from the Aperture Showcase. He spent his days shooting and his nights developing, falling into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar. Street photography in Manhattan, portraits of artists in their studios, a long-term project documenting the last remaining film labs in New York, knowing, because he'd lived through it, that most of them would be gone within a decade. His phone rang less often. Some college friends had drifted away, put off by his intensity, his single-minded focus on his work. Others had graduated and moved to different cities, different lives. Marcus didn't mind the solitude. He'd spent 22 years in the wrong life, surrounded by the wrong people. This loneliness felt purposeful. In August, he got a call from Magnum. "We've been following your work," the voice said. Michael Santos, the director, the same man his professor had told him to contact. "The Aperture show, the Voice article, the lab project. We're interested in you joining our associate program." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. In the original timeline, he'd been rejected from Magnum. The rejection letter was still burned into his memory. "While we appreciate your talent, we don't feel your vision aligns with our current direction." "What would that involve?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Mentorship, access to our network, support for long-term projects. We don't take many people, and it's not a guarantee of full membership, but it's a start. I mostly shoot film. We know, that's part of why we're interested. Everyone's rushing toward digital. You're swimming against the current. That takes conviction." After the call, Marcus sat in his studio, looking at the negatives hanging in the drawing cabinet, the contact sheets spread across his work table, the prints pinned to the walls, swimming against the current. That's what it had felt like in the original timeline too, except then he'd been doing it alone, without support, slowly drowning. This time, he had a lifeline. The years blurred. 2005 became 2006, became 2007. Marcus shot constantly, obsessively building a body of work that felt both urgent and timeless. He documented the last video rental stores in the city, knowing they'd be extinct within 5 years. He photographed the construction of the new World Trade Center, the slow vertical growth of steel and glass from ground that was still sacred. He did a series on elderly immigrants in Chinatown, their faces mapped with decades of hard work and harder choices. The Film Lab project became a book, published by a small press in Portland. The Latent Image, the end of film photography, sold modestly, but received serious critical attention. The New York Times review called it elegiac without being sentimental, a document of an art form in transition. Marcus kept his Leica M6, his Hasselblad, all the equipment he'd sold in the original timeline. He added to the collection carefully a Pentax 67 for landscape work, a vintage Nikon F with a collection of prime lenses, a Rolleiflex TLR that shot the most beautiful medium format negatives he'd ever seen. He dated occasionally, a fellow photographer he met at a gallery opening, relationship that lasted 3 months before she moved to LA. A painter from his building, brilliant and chaotic, who broke up with him because he was too stable, too focused. A journalist who covered environmental issues, no, who understood deadlines and obsession, but who ultimately wanted someone who could travel with her to disaster zones, and Marcus was too committed to his darkroom, his projects, his carefully controlled life. He didn't mind being single. After Cassandra, both the abbreviated version in this timeline and the extended suffering in the original, he'd learned to value solitude, to protect his creative space fiercely. In 2008, the financial crisis hit. Marcus, knowing it was coming, had been preparing. He'd saved aggressively, invested conservatively. When the real estate market crashed, he bought a small apartment in Brooklyn, a 1-bedroom with good light and space for a proper darkroom. The mortgage was less than his studio rent had been. His mother, calling to check on him during the worst of the crisis, was confused by his lack of panic. "You know, the news says people are losing their jobs, their homes. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mom. I saw it coming." How? Marcus paused. How could he explain that he'd lived through this once before, Had watched friends lose their savings, had scrambled for freelance work while the industry contracted. I pay attention to the market. I was careful. You should have been a businessman, like your cousin Jeffrey. Jeffrey filed for bankruptcy last month, Mom. Silence. Then, oh, well, maybe photography is okay. By 2010, Marcus was 31 years old and his work was in the permanent collections of 3 major museums. He'd done editorial work for National Geographic, The New Yorker, the Paris Review. His prints sold for 5 figures. He'd published 2 more books. The Magnum Associate program had led to full membership. See, he was successful in ways that the original timeline Marcus had never imagined possible. But he was also lonely in ways he couldn't articulate. The vintage camera market began to heat up around 2012. Marcus watched it happen on the forums and auction sites, watched prices climb as digital photography reached saturation, and people started to crave the tangibility of film, the unpredictability, the deliberate pace that made you think before you shot. His Leica M6 was now worth $15,000. The Hasselblad, $12,000. The collection he'd assembled, piece by piece, was approaching $80,000 in value. He could sell, he could liquidate everything, invest the money, never worry about rent again. He didn't. Instead, he bought more. A limited edition Leica M monochrome when it was released, knowing, because he'd lived through the future, that it would appreciate. A pristine Contax II before the hipsters discovered it and drove the price to absurdity. A Mamiya 7, the rangefinder medium format camera that would become legendary. He wasn't collecting for investment, he was collecting for love. Each camera was a tool, a specific way of seeing the world, and he used them all. The Leica for street work, the Hasselblad for portraits, the Mamiya for landscapes. Each one forced him to think differently, to see differently. In 2015, May called him, her voice tight with stress. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Okay. David got laid off. The savings account is almost empty. We have 3 kids in school and a mortgage, and I don't know how we're going to make it through the summer. She took a breath. You're doing well. I see your work in magazines. I hear about your exhibitions. Can you loan us $50,000? Marcus's chest tightened. In the original timeline, he'd been broke at 35, barely scraping by on wedding photography gigs and teaching adjunct courses for poverty wages. He'd had nothing to give May when she'd needed help. She'd had to sell the house, move the kids to a smaller place in a worse school district. The shame had nearly broken her. You don't need a loan, he said. I'll give you the money. Marcus, I can't. Yes, you can. You're my sister. You were there when I needed you. I'm here now. I'll pay you back. Don't. Use it for the kids. David will find another job. This is just temporary. After he hung up, Marcus looked at his camera collection, displayed on custom shelves in his apartment. He could have sold one camera and covered May's need. Could have sold the Leica M6, the one that would be worth $43,000 in 4 more years, and had money left over. But he didn't need to. He'd been smart. He'd invested. He had money in the bank, money in index funds, money in the Brooklyn apartment that had tripled in value. He had everything except someone to share it with. The gallery opening in 2016 was supposed to be routine. Another exhibition, another crowd of collectors and critics, and people drinking free wine. Marcus stood in the corner, as usual, watching people interact with his work. A new series on aging ballet dancers, their bodies both graceful and broken, their faces showing the cost of art. These are extraordinary, someone said. Marcus turned. She was tall, Asian, maybe mid-30s. Yeah, wearing a simple black dress and no jewelry except small silver earrings. She had a Leica MA around her neck, the fully mechanical version, no light meter, just pure German engineering and photographic faith. Thank you, he said. I'm Emma Jong. I curate at the Met. She extended her hand, and when Marcus shook it, he felt calluses, the same kind he had from years of handling cameras and developing film. You shoot? He asked, nodding at the Leica. When I have time? Which is almost never. She smiled. But I try. Film keeps me honest, makes me think about each frame. They talked for an hour, then 2, about photography and art, and the impossible balance between making work and making a living, about the loneliness of the creative life, how you could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone, about film versus digital, the texture of grain, the alchemy of the darkroom. When the gallery closed, they stood on the sidewalk, neither quite ready to leave. Do you want to get coffee? Emma asked. It's 11 p.m. There's a diner near here. 24 hours? Yeah. They sat in a booth, drinking terrible coffee, talking until the sun came up. Emma told him about growing up in Beijing, immigrating to the US at 12, feeling caught between two cultures, and finding refuge in museums, in art, in the silent company of photographs. Marcus told her about his work, about the projects he was planning, about the belief that film was having a resurgence, that what seemed like a dying medium was actually transforming into something more precious. He didn't tell her about the rebirth, about living through 22 years twice, about knowing the future. Some secrets were too strange to share, but when she asked to see his darkroom, he said yes. They were married in 2018, a small ceremony in Prospect Park, just family and close friends. Marcus's mother cried. May gave a speech about how she'd never thought her weird little brother would find someone who understood him, but clearly Emma was just as weird, so it worked. Emma moved into his apartment, turned the second bedroom into her own darkroom. They worked side by side, developing film in adjacent trays, the smell of chemistry and the red glow of safe lights creating a shared intimacy that felt more profound than conversation. I have a confession, Emma said one night, both of them elbow deep in developer. What? I Googled you before the gallery opening. I'd seen your work and I wanted to meet you. Marcus laughed. So it wasn't random? Nothing about me is random. I'm a curator. I plan everything. She looked at him over the tray. Does that bother you? No. I think it's perfect. In 2019, Marcus's Leica M6 sold at auction. Not his, but one identical to it. Same year, same configuration. The final price, $43,000. Emma showed him the listing on her phone. Jesus, do you know what yours is worth? I do. Are you going to sell? Marcus looked at the camera sitting on his desk, the chrome worn from decades of use, the leather strap molded to his neck, the rangefinder eyepiece scratched from where his glasses had rubbed against it 10,000 times. No. Even for $43,000? Even for that, Emma kissed him. Good answer. The pandemic hit in 2020, and the world stopped. Marcus, who had lived through this once before, was prepared in ways that seemed prescient to everyone else. He'd stocked up on supplies in February. He'd moved money out of the market in early March. He'd told Emma they should postpone their trip to Japan, even though she'd argued it was being alarmist. How did you know? She asked when the lockdown started and the death tolls climbed. I pay attention, Marcus said. Which was true, if incomplete. They quarantined together in the Brooklyn apartment, 2 dark rooms running simultaneously, both of them shooting the empty city from their windows, the masked joggers, the delivery workers who became the only human presence on abandoned streets. Emma did a series on medical workers at her hospital across the street, shooting through telephoto lenses, respecting distance while capturing exhaustion. So Marcus returned to an old project. Photographing the neighborhood where he'd grown up in Queens, documenting the changes, the gentrification, the displacement. The old Chinese bakery his mother had taken him to every Sunday. Closed forever. The video store where he'd rented Wong Kar-wai films as a teenager. Now a Starbucks. The community center where he'd learned to develop his first roll of film, converted to luxury condos. Everything changed. Everything ended. But the photographs remained. In 2022, Emma told him she was pregnant. Marcus held the positive test in his hand, staring at the 2 pink lines, and felt something unlock in his chest. In the original timeline, he'd never had children. Cassandra hadn't wanted them, and after she left, he'd been too bitter, too broken, too busy trying to rebuild his life to think about family. Now, though, at 43, he was going to be a father. Are you okay? Emma asked, watching his face. I'm perfect. You're crying. I know. They had a daughter in January 2023, born during a snowstorm, her first breath accompanied by the howl of wind against the hospital windows. They named her Lily, and Marcus took photographs, hundreds of them, thousands, documenting every moment, every expression, the way she gripped his finger, the way Emma held her, the way light fell across her face while she slept. He used the Leica M6. Of course he did. In 2024, Marcus received a call from a collector in Tokyo. The man spoke perfect English with a slight British accent. Mr. Chen, my name is Takeshi Yamamoto. I'm building a collection of significant 20th century cameras, particularly Leica M series with documented provenance. I understand you own an M6 from 1989 with a 50mm Summilux that has been featured in several of your exhibitions. I do. I'm prepared to offer you $75,000 for the camera and lens. Marcus nearly dropped the phone. $75,000. Nearly twice the auction price from 5 years ago. Enough to fully fund Lily's college education. Enough to buy a bigger apartment, a house upstate, financial security for his family. It's not for sale. I can go higher, $85,000, final offer. It's not about the money. Everything is about money, Mr. Chen. Not this. Yamamoto was silent for a moment. May I ask why? It's just a tool. No, Marcus said. It's not. How could he explain? This camera had been with him through both lifetimes? In the original timeline, he'd sold it to fund Cassandra's failing business, watched it disappear into someone else's collection, spent years regretting the loss. In this timeline, he'd kept it, protected it, used it to build a career, a life, a legacy. It had photographed his sister's first child, his exhibition at Aperture, the empty city during the pandemic, his daughter's first moments. It wasn't a tool. It was a witness. It was proof that he'd made different choices, better choices, that he'd valued the right things. I appreciate the offer, Marcus said, but my answer is no. After he hung up, Emma emerged from her darkroom, chemistry stains on her hands. Who was that? Someone who wanted to buy the Leica. For how much? $85,000? Emma whistled. And you said no? I said no. She crossed the room, wrapped her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder. You know I love you, right? I do. And you know that's completely insane, right? Also, yes. Good. As long as we're clear. Marcus turned, kissed her, tasted the acetic acid from the stop bath she'd been mixing. 45 years old, married to a woman who understood him, father to a daughter who would grow up in a house full of cameras and art, successful in his career, stable in his life. He'd had a second chance, and he'd taken it. The exhibition opened in 2026. Marcus's retrospective at the Met. 50 years of photography, or 23 years, depending on how you counted. Images spanning from his undergraduate work to his most recent projects. The Leica M6 was displayed in a glass case, not as a working tool, but as an artifact, with a placard explaining its significance. This camera was used to create many of the images in this exhibition. For the artist, it represents the continuity of vision across decades of work. Marcus stood in the gallery during the opening, Lily on his hip, Emma beside him, surrounded by his life frozen in silver and light. May was there with her family, her oldest daughter now in college, studying architecture. His mother, now in her 70s, walked slowly through the exhibition with his father, who pointed at images and said, I remember that building, or that corner used to be different. Robert Hartley, the collector who'd offered to buy his prints from the Aperture show 20 years ago, approached with a smile. You should have sold me those prints, he said. Probably. They're worth $50,000 each now. I know. No regrets? Marcus looked around the gallery, at the life he'd built, the choices he'd made, the path he'd taken. In another timeline, another life, he'd made different choices. He'd sacrificed his art for someone who didn't value it. He'd sold his equipment, his vision, his connection to the world. He'd woken up at 45 and realized he'd spent 22 years becoming someone he didn't recognize. No regrets, Marcus said. After the reception, when the crowds had thinned and the gallery was preparing to close, Marcus asked the curator if he could have a moment alone with the exhibition. She smiled, understanding something unspoken, and left him there. He stood in front of the Leica in its case, this object that had been with him through everything, this witness to both lives. In the glass reflection, he could see his own face. Older now, lines around his eyes from squinting through viewfinders, gray threading through his hair, and behind it, ghostly and superimposed, the images on the gallery walls. A life in photographs. A life of photographs. He'd been given an impossible gift, the chance to live twice, to make different choices, to become someone better. And the strange thing was, it hadn't been the big choices that mattered most. Not avoiding Cassandra, not investing wisely, not knowing the future. It had been the small ones, choosing to go to his sister's side when her daughter was born, choosing to keep his cameras when everyone said digital was the future, choosing to value his art over comfort. his vision over success as others defined it. The Leica sat in its case, chrome and black leather, worn and loved and real, worth $85,000, maybe more now, worth everything, in ways that had nothing to do with money. Marcus placed his hand against the glass, and for just a moment, he could feel it. The weight of light, the pull of time, the infinite possibility contained in a single frame. The past and the present and the future, all visible at once, all frozen in silver, all testament to the choices we make and the lives we build from them. Outside, through the gallery windows, the city continued its endless motion. Inside, the photographs hung still and silent, moments captured and preserved, light made permanent. Marcus took one last look at the camera that had changed everything by staying the same, then turned and walked toward the exit, toward his family waiting in the lobby, toward the rest of his life, knowing that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is hold on to what matters, even when the whole world is telling you to let go. The weight of the Leica around his neck, his current one, the one not in the case, was familiar and comforting as he stepped out into the February evening. He raised it to his eye, framed his wife and daughter waiting by the door, saw them through the rangefinder exactly as they were, perfect, present, real. He pressed the shutter. The moment became permanent. Life unfolded like light, constantly moving, impossible to hold, visible only in the moments we choose to preserve. And Marcus Chen, who had lived twice and learned the same lesson both times, had finally mastered the art of choosing well.